The story of the Great Depression. This is what happened. How could a country experiencing one of its biggest economic booms ever suddenly become one where its citizens struggled to even put food on the table? We are going to explore that today as we take a look at the Great Depression and what exactly happened for the things to turn bad so quickly. The story of this monumental event in U.S. history is still being studied today by historians and economists alike, which only goes to show how there is still so much that most people don't know. We will be covering all of it, including some shockingly new developments that might change how you think about this event forever. So make sure you stick around for the whole video so you don't miss it. Chapter 1. What America was like leading up to the Great Depression. Most of you probably know at least a little bit about how the Great Depression impacted Americans just a few generations ago. But most people don't really think about what the country was like leading up to it. The 1920s were nicknamed the Roaring Twenties because of how strong the economy became immediately following the First World War. The stock market also became incredibly important during the decade, with everyone from billionaires to janitors or fry cooks trying their hand at it in an effort to make some fast cash. This was probably the height of the American Dream era, where it truly did feel like on any given day, a regular person could turn their life around and make it rich. Americans began to make wild speculations in the stock market, investing in companies based on rumors or what their friends were saying. By the end of the decade, everyone was too busy having fun and throwing parties to realize that things were starting to change. Production had begun to fall, and unemployment was rising. Some speculate that this was in part because people were happier gambling on a big payday than getting a steady job. It's sort of hard to blame people though, as wages were pretty low too. The stock market was still valuing companies though way higher than they were actually worth. That wasn't the only reason why things were setting up for an absolutely massive disaster though. There were also issues that were beyond the control of the people, with factors like droughts hampering the agricultural district of the nation. Despite these natural factors impacting the country's ability to produce food, the price for food continued to fall. Around the same time, banks continued to approve loans for money that didn't really even exist. That meant the country was essentially teetering on the brink of a huge issue. People thought that they had more money than they actually did, and they also believed that things were much better than they were. In the summer of 1929, America dipped into a small recession. This happens from time to time though, and people began preparing to tighten the old belt until everything blew over. Except it didn't. Chapter 2. The stock market crash of 1929. The date was October 24th, 1929, and everything was about to change. The era of free spending on the stock exchange was already ending, and investors were starting to get nervous. A stock market crash seemed like it could happen any day, and everyone desperately hoped they could right the ship in time. That is not what happened. Instead, on the 24th of October, as anxious stockholders began quickly selling their overvalued shares all at once, the stock market finally gave way. 12.9 million shares were sold on that day, a record, and the day itself is still commonly referred to as Black Friday. Only 5 days later, Black Tuesday would hit. This time, 16 million shares were sold as confidence in the country's stock market dwindled. Millions of these shares were basically valueless at this point though, but it gets worse. Some investors bought their shares on margin, which essentially means that it was with borrowed money. This was almost like a double hit for both the investor as well as the economy, as the country's money was losing its value incredibly fast. Almost nobody believed in the stock market at this point, and a lot of people straight up felt like they were tricked or lied to. As a result, factories and other production industries took a hit as well. The spending and investing that went into these factories was now completely gone, and as a result, production slowed and people were fired. Those that were lucky enough to keep their jobs ended up having to work for way less than they were making before, and with that, the consumer buying power plummeted too. Seemingly all at once, foreclosures and repossessions started to hit people hard, and Americans who bought things on credit fell into a deep hole of debt. This didn't just affect Americans, however, although it may have hit them the hardest. Because of the gold standard, which linked the entire world through a fixed currency exchange, other countries began to feel the effects of America's depression too. This was especially true in Europe, which had some close ties to the United States. Before we get to the next chapter, which is the part where things really start to snowball, we just want to say that we hope you are enjoying the video so far. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos. Chapter 3. The banks and Herbert Hoover failed to slow the tide. Herbert Hoover tried his best to calm down not only the nation, but the rest of the world at this point. He told them that this would soon pass, and both the national and world economy would bounce back in no time. Unfortunately, as we all know, this wasn't true. By the year 1930, 4 million Americans were without a job, and by the next year, another 2 million joined them. At the same time, the country's industrial sector continued to suffer, and production had been cut in half. Bread lines and soup kitchens became familiar sights for Americans in both the cities as well as in small towns. Crazily enough, farmers were actually forced to leave their crops rotting in the fields since nobody was able to give them the money to harvest them. Droughts continued to hit the southern part of the country, from Texas all the way to Nebraska. This led to a lot of deaths as high winds and dust killed crops, livestock, and people alike. This was called the Dust Bowl, and it pushed a lot of people from rural areas into big cities. During the fall of 1930, things took yet another turn for the worse, in what is probably the biggest factor for why the Great Depression continued to get worse. People became fed up with the banks and started to demand their money back from their accounts. This made the banks nervous, as they had already given out so much money they didn't even have from loans. This forced them to liquidate these loans in a last-second desperation move to stay afloat. Despite this, by early 1933, thousands of banks had shut down, and Hoover had begun issuing out government loans to help the remaining banks stay afloat. Hoover did not believe that the government had any responsibility to intervene on behalf of the almost 15 million unemployed Americans, though, and that he wouldn't try to create jobs or provide any kind of economic relief. This would lead to an election in 1932 where Franklin D. Roosevelt won by a landslide. Chapter 4. FDR and the New Deal. President Roosevelt uttered perhaps the most famous words of any president in American history during his inauguration speech. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he said to the country and the world that day. During his first 100 days in office, his administration went to work, passing legislation that would help both the industrial and agricultural sectors, creating both jobs as well as slowly helping to restore the economy. Then FDR struck with one of the biggest ideas while in office. The New Deal was formed, addressing things like unemployment by creating jobs programs. These programs created 8.5 million jobs from 1935 to 1943. But that wasn't all. President Roosevelt also created the Social Security system that we know today, giving Americans unemployment benefits as well as disability, and also creating pensions for old age. All of this helped to crack open the economy, and to help not only stabilize the country, but get everyone going out and spending a bit again. Things started to look good again, until the year 1937, when another sharp recession hit people just as they were starting to feel good about the state of affairs again. This recession would spark a lot more than you might think, and reversed a lot of the gains that the country had made in both production and unemployment. It single-handedly extended the Great Depression up to the end of the decade, where otherwise it was almost in the rearview mirror. Not only this, but Depression-era hardships sparked extreme actions in other parts of the world. This most notably was true in Germany, where Adolf Hitler's regime led to increased German aggression and eventually the Second World War. And that about wraps up the Great Depression. Did you think that Hoover was in the wrong for not providing aid for the country? Or do you think that FDR was a little too loose with how he chose to stimulate the economy? Let us know in the comments section. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed, and to subscribe to the channel.